Before we get started, if this is going to work for me, I'd like to start by acknowledging the territory that we're on. And of course, as most of us know, we're on Treaty 6 territory, which is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Dakota Sioux, as well as the Métis. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. If you are in the session called Austerity in Alberta, Workers Under the Right, then you're in the right place. However, if you were looking for populism in social media, you should be across the hallway, just so you know, okay? We are very honored to have as our guests two distinguished speakers. First, we're going to have Alison McIntosh, followed by Jason Foster. They'll both talk for a little while, and then after that, I'm not putting any time limits on them. They can go as long as they like, as long as we're done by 3:45, right? Okay. Following that, we'll have questions and answers so that you guys can all you folks can all get involved. So I'm not going to read their bios unless anyone sticks up their hand and says they need to have them read out. Nope. Then with that short introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Alison to start us off.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So my name is Alison McIntosh. I am one of the research managers here at Parkland, and today I am going to talk to you about some of the emerging research that we have going on around long-term care work in Alberta. So I'm really happy that we started with a land acknowledgement. I think that it's really important that we place these conversations within the context of our obligations to treaty, but also to ground it in the land and landscape that we exist in, especially when we're talking about the context of long-term care, which of course has long legacies like almost every other institution in this province, with long legacies of colonialism, particularly when it comes to the people that we see as being worthy of receiving care and the people that we deem as the people who have to provide it. So again, with a reminder that we're all treaty people, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation today and look forward to hearing from you at the end as well. So today we're going to talk about long-term austerity and also long-term care work in this province. Who here knows someone who has lived or is living in a long-term care setting? That includes continuing care, assisted livings. Yeah, it's a very common experience, especially towards the end of life for many Canadian people. Although people do live in long-term and continuing care settings at other life stages as well, especially people who have neuromuscular degenerative disorders and people who have suffered serious accidents and things like that. But it's especially common for an elder care setting. So a lot of the data that I'll be drawing on today comes from that world. So today I'm going to talk about the background of what the care landscape looks like in Canada and Alberta specifically. We'll go through what neoliberalism and austerity are and have done to us and continue to do. And then we'll move into some preliminary results from some of the research that I'm doing right now. Long-term care can be taken as a specific site or a general concept. So as a specific site, it refers to a place often that's for maybe a higher needs patient, someone who has more intensive healthcare needs. But as a general term, it can encompass things like assisted living, lodges, different kinds of accommodations and care settings. but they can also be nonprofit, for-profit, and public ways to provide care and lodging. So in general, long-term care is intended for individuals who are experiencing chronically unstable health, who because of their condition cannot live independently in their homes, but who also do not require the specialized medical equipment and constant physician observation that's offered in a hospital. In Alberta, we talk a lot about a continuum of care. Alberta has emphasized this ideal of a continuum of care that starts with aging in place, so in your own home, which leaves out a lot of, especially seniors who have never had their own home, then progresses through increasingly care-intense settings. Policies and budgets promoting the continuum of care model began in Alberta in the 1990s, and it encourages people to remain in their community as long as possible, which a lot of people view as a really good thing, a really desirable thing. A lot of people do want that for themselves, but it's also used as a way to cut costs and reduce budgets for elder care and long-term care. As we'll see, the long-term belt-tightening has negative impacts on the quality of care that people can receive in residential care settings, and also on working conditions for people that are going into these settings every day. The differences between assisted living and long-term care are very porous and continuous. They are not discrete terms by any stretch of the imagination. And people can progress through the levels of care in the same site sometimes, or sometimes they do have to move as their care needs change. So in general, assisted living facilities specifically are more likely to be privately run, that is, and have residents with less complicated health needs, so they have a lower cost of care. The for-profit owners make more money. Assisted livings also levy extra costs for residents that are associated with medication dispensing, specialized supplies, equipments, and therapies. In general, long-term care sites have residents with more complex healthcare needs. They have higher costs of care and need more staff time. They're also more likely to be public, and because it's less profitable for private businesses to provide care to people with more intensive needs. So, on that last one, accommodation and healthcare in residential settings are also treated as separate. So residents pay for the accommodation or hoteling costs of that part of their care, and then the government pays for the health needs. Of course, almost no one is in a long-term care setting and can still live in their own space. So most people in long-term care are there because they can't live on their own. So it is sort of a justice aspect when they're also required to pay for those cost of living things. Canada, as you probably know, you've heard before, we have an aging population, and there's two ways that we've ended up in there being quite a gap between the supply of long-term care and the demand. One of them is in the infrastructure itself of having long-term care beds, and the other is in a gap in terms of the appropriateness of care. So Canada has around 255,000 long-term care beds. The current demand, so like right now, or the study was as of 2 years ago, there is about 8,000 more demand than there is supply. That's projected to grow to needing 199,000 more beds by 2035. And the economic benefits that exist for building long-term care often aren't talked about. It's often seen as just a strict cost, but of course we know that people need to work in these sites. That is a good thing for the economy. Building these sites in the first place, it requires building trades and requires outlay of like infrastructure and building out that whole service. So they are pretty good for the economy, but they can be a challenge to convince taxpayers to want to fund because they sound really expensive, even though, again, most of us have a common experience of having someone who does end up in care, whether that's you or someone you know. And so it's it can be a little hard to sort of square that between like, this is care that we all need, but it's also care that's quite expensive. So, of course, this is also assuming in terms of the economic benefits that will actually appropriately staff all those facilities, which, as I'm going to get into, currently isn't true. And that refers to the acceptable care and the minimum care standards, which Alberta long-term care facilities do not meet, regardless of their provision type. So there's a current gap between the care provided and the care required. The care gap is due partially to increased resident acuity. We have people that are living longer with more complicated health needs, but it's also due to systemic understaffing. And again, that happens whether it's a public facility, nonprofit, or for-profit. there's care deficits across all the ownership types, although for-profit does have the biggest one with reported an hour and 10 minutes lower than the minimum standard of care as the average in privately owned long-term care. So focus groups with formal and informal care providers by the Alberta Gerontology Workers Action Group. So this is people who are doing care work in their own home, probably not paid for it. So like family caregivers, things like that, and then also formal caregivers in residential sites, identified 4 key issues with long-term care. The first being capacity and appropriateness, so like the levels of care just aren't right. Care quality, policies and practices impacting frontline care, and quality of life. So they recommended focusing on what carers want, not what we can afford, and empowering frontline staff, because we know that the people who provide care know what their residents need and know what they need in order to provide the best possible care. And that's not really what gets reflected in the policies and in the management practices that happen in long-term care facilities. So increasing staffing levels has been shown to improve the quality of care. This should not be surprising, both in terms of what we know about the impact of fatigue on how people work, and also in terms of the impacts of stress in general on relationships between people. That can include the carer and the caregiver, or care receiver and caregiver, or between staff members, between staff and management. All those things are impacted by short staffing. Short staffing creates opportunities for violence against workers and against residents, and violence is quite pervasive in long-term care settings. And that's been shown by nurses' unions in other jurisdictions. So, in addition to not feeling heard or supported and facing violence, the impacts of increasing patient acuity without adequate staffing are shown in slower response to call bells, inadequate incontinence care, missing or rushed scheduled baths, missing therapies, getting inadequate therapy, not being able to get to your therapy because there's no one even there to drive you to it, and then risk of injury and medication errors, again, due to fatigue, to rushing, and to not knowing, not having a close one-to-one relationship with the person who is providing the care and the person who's receiving it. And expanding opportunities for for-profit participation in elder care, so again, those private delivery models. In Alberta, the provincial government promotes a move towards a delivery model that is associated with lower quality of care. And we've seen that over the last 20 and 30 years. Which brings me to neoliberalism. It's not just a word for everything I hate. It's also one way to understand where the issues are coming from in long-term care. And I feel like the framing under neoliberalism and new public management and the shadow state is quite helpful for understanding what is happening and what we're dealing with. So neoliberalism is, of course, an economic, political, and ideological set of policies and beliefs that purport to be market-oriented, like eliminating price controls, deregulating markets, lowering trade barriers, and reducing government influence in the economy, in social services, notably with long-term care, in the social safety net, and especially through privatization and austerity. It is a political project, so this is something that we are being sold by policymakers. Specifically, the shadow state and new public management refer to the contracting out of formerly government services to charities, nonprofits, and private companies. And particularly through nonprofits who end up doing the enforcing, the policing, and the gatekeeping that the government used to do when they were providing services as part of the social safety net. One way in which this manifests is through increasing workloads and demands for documentation. So atomizing the tasks that people are expected to do, demanding particular documentation of how that needs to happen, and doing more standardized care instead of the kind of one-on-one relational care that you might expect, especially if you're someone who's had to do care work yourself. Government systematically devolves its role as a service provider, and it's also rolling back funding. So the shadow state and new public management has contracting out of the formerly government services as a standard approach for care. So nonprofits are doing the work that used to be done by government, and it makes it difficult for workers to understand their work within that whole system of like atomized, specific, standardized care. There's fewer opportunities for longer, open-ended care interactions. And compared to other institutions in civil society, you can think of like nonprofit social services and community organization. Long-term care organizations and their workers are less likely than other nonprofits to have an explicitly social justice orientation. This is really important because long-term care workers actually get very few opportunities in the context of their work to examine long-term care as a larger social justice policy project. A lot of that is due to their employer-driven training, and then policies that are less or not at all focused on justice, and also on their training backgrounds in various disciplines that aren't necessarily, social justice and the humanities, right? So you're going in already without that kind of systemic worldview that sees where your work and your institution fit into a broader landscape of deregulation, neoliberalization, and shadow state policies. So one way these problems manifest is under these conditions, unpaid extra work or unpaid overtime is seen as the norm, and it's actually condoned by managers and even some unions. It's unpaid care, but I think one thing that this research is hoping to do in the future is to tease out the ways in which unpaid care can be a form of self-exploitation, but also a form of resistance towards uncaring government and management. So there's definitely an interplay and a tension there that hopefully when I go through the work that we're hoping to do, we'll be able to kind of tease that out a little bit in the future. Long-term care issues are ultimately not just individual and private, they're collective for users and for workers. Again, people often aren't empowered within the context of long-term care to see it that way, both for residents and for workers. New public management, shadow state, austerity, all those kind of interchangeable terms, atomizes long-term care struggles and makes it difficult to do long-term care work in a collective, social, and politicized way that can build solidarity around solutions for users, workers, and the community. For example, it is very rare to have long-term care activism outside of the union structure. So we can expand these issues to specific kinds of facilities. Private providers make higher returns compared to nonprofit and public providers due to lower spending on direct care costs, as I mentioned earlier. Nonprofit and public spend a little bit more on direct care than for-profit spaces. And under the shadow of bed deficits, there's ongoing austerity budgeting that we know from the very recent Albertan context that has resulted in this set of policies called patient and care-based funding. So this is a relatively new set of funding mechanisms in Alberta. The funding that facilities receive is based on the number of beds and assessed care needs, but it's also based on quote-unquote quality funding that is on achieving standardized targets. So for example, like rates of immunization and stuff like that. It really gets to the contracting out and to the benchmarking aspects of neoliberalism. Another notable thing is that Alberta Health Services funds all facilities assuming wages that are equivalent to those under AHS collective agreements. So private operators get the same level of funding even if they pay their workers less. Again, another way that they can make money off of providing long-term care. One thing to note is that we do have a lot of data gaps. We know quite a lot about long-term care patients and residents. For example, the Canadian Institute for Health Information provides every year this continuing care reporting system that tells you a lot about the kinds of people that are in long-term care, the medical issues that they face, their length of stay, the conditions under which they're discharged, all those sorts of things, especially those in public facilities. For example, AHS does annual reports that have a certain amount of information around the number of beds they have and all that kind of stuff. But there's less publicly available information about nonprofit and for-profit facilities. Alberta also used to have a committee that reviewed long-term care facilities and did annual reporting. It was called the Health Facilities Review Committee. It was abolished in 2013, and there's nothing that really fills that role now. It wasn't perfect because the review committee members were not necessarily trained in that kind of care or that kind of facility, so they weren't, experts. But now there's no review mechanism for that kind of systematically reports the quality of care that people get in residential care settings. Care is reported in paid care hours or nursing care hours, but that isn't actually the direct care hours that a person living in long-term care receives. So that can include desk work, vacation, sick days, and training, which means that when the number of nursing hours are reported, it does obscure insufficient hours of care, having to work short, and all of the issues that nurses and other healthcare providers face in long-term care facilities that are quite rampant. Also, the proportion of paid hours that are direct care hours varies based on jurisdiction, job type, and job category, so there isn't like a straight proportion of these paid hours that you can even say, okay, well, 70% of them are actual care hours. That's not true, depending on the type of job and the type of facility you're in. Which brings us to the Alberta Long-Term Care Worker Survey, which is the survey that we're doing right now. So CUPE approached Parkland to do a survey of people that work in long-term care facilities. CUPE, of course, represents a lot of healthcare aides, administrative staff, people who do maintenance in long-term care across the province. They have 4,575 long-term care workers in Alberta. And you'll notice that their workers are not people like RNs, another group of people who we have a lot more data about their conditions of work. So this is really filling a data gap that we don't know the systemic issues that face the people that are working in these kinds of settings who don't necessarily have the same kinds of decision-making and management powers that others do. We know that workload, like overwork and burnout, are rampant in long-term care, but we want to get a better sense of what causes that and what we could do to make that better, so that CUPE wants to use that data to understand workload and burnout in their members, ensure their member issues are heard, and fight for that in bargaining and in communications, so that people feel heard, and also so that we can communicate the kinds of specific things that people in these settings are facing. Of course, workload and burnout issues exist in many fields. I'm sure all of you have experienced this in one way or another. So we're hoping that the survey and its associated tools will be able to be used in other working contexts as well, and in other kinds of environments. This work is very preliminary, so we don't have a lot of the data that it'll produce in the future, so please do stay tuned. But we have been collecting some really interesting quotes that certainly back up the things that we found in the literature, things that we know anecdotally, and especially around conditions of work, overwork, that certainly don't surprise when they come through. So some of you have gotten some sheets of paper, and we don't have enough data to make overarching claims about representativeness, but we do have some illustrative quotes that back up data from other studies and nonprofit work in general in a neoliberal context. So I'm going to start out. Your quotes are numbered. One of the first questions that we asked that had an opportunity for people to give open response was, what would you do if you had more time? So let's hear from quote one. So organize their closets, cut their nails, and shower them every day. Things that you might consider to be basic levels of care, but this is if they had more time. They do not have sufficient time to do their day-to-day work. How about quote two?
Thoroughly clean rather than only what is necessary.
So again, things that we might consider to be a normal part of work. How about quote three? Yeah, so quote two was thoroughly clean rather than only what is necessary. So this person reports that they would like to research and learn more about how to do their job better because they're usually rushing too much to keep up. Most people say things when they respond to this question along the lines of pay more attention to residents, particularly their social or emotional needs, help their coworkers, or most commonly, do more work. It indicates that people don't feel like they have enough to do their job well or even to do their job at all. As described earlier, overwork and understaffing is rampant in long-term care in Alberta. It affects workers who report feeling burned out, demoralized, like they're always in a hurry. This phenomenon also affects residents in ways that can impact their quality of life and sometimes even jeopardizes their health, which takes us to, in your opinion, what were the potential or actual hazards to patients and residents from your work site's workload and staffing situation? Quote 4.
Female, age 59, white. Decreased nutritional status, dehydration. When I arrived to set up, begin a morning recreation program, for example, at 10 or 11 o'clock, I see residents whose meals are being removed after having sat uneaten or only partially eaten. People are missing full meals, not getting hot meals or beverages. This is something I see daily.
So this recreational therapist reported that the people that they're helping with recreation see decreased nutritional status and hydration because there isn't adequate staff support to help them eat and to drink at mealtime. And she reports seeing that every day. Systemic understaffing means many workers have to work out of scope. So this recreational therapist was helping people feed even though their job is to do social activities. It also illustrates that patient well-being is at risk when management does not ensure adequate care. Which takes us to, is there anything important to your work that we missed? Quote 5. So this worker reported we need justice, respect, and equal rights that they feel are invisible at their workplace. How about quote 6? So this person reports having a high workload and a high stress environment, but only being scheduled for 6 hours per day, that they're tired of having a part-time job and that they have no life. Quote 7?
This is a female, age 48, white. I haven't had a raise in 15 years. I'd like one.
I haven't had a raise in 15 years and I would like one. That's common, sadly. So in terms of takeaways and next steps, the quotes that you just read, thank you for embodying the voices of the workers, support evidence from other research studies on long-term care work, but we will know more further along in the study about care issues that are specific to CUPE's long-term care workers. This project is ongoing. We will have more specifics about the causes and consequences of workload and burnout, and we will have a better understanding of what management and government decisions have the biggest impacts on long-term care workers. Other studies recommend policies to ensure things like a good staff mix, staffing guidelines, better pay, and legislating minimum staffing levels so that the gap between care required and care provided is not there. Hopefully that would improve both worker outcomes and also patient and resident outcomes. Austerity budgets and the neoliberal shadow state policymaking are direct causes of staff burnout, low pay, and overwork. Notably, much of the research that exists currently is about nurses working in these kinds of environments, but the workers that we're talking about include LPNs and healthcare aides, but not registered nurses. Those are the nurses with the largest scope of work and also the highest pay. So we anticipate that situations for lower paid care workers are more dire, given that they are typically not involved in setting policy and procedures, so they have a lack of control at work, and they have physically demanding jobs that put them at the front lines of the policies and procedures that, again, they do not get to influence. So far, we found that workers face pressure from management and by extension the government to meet care standards while putting up with overwork and short staffing, or even doing unpaid work and certainly not getting paid overtime. They work out of scope for the training and role that they have and accept low pay without raises that match the need that they have and match the increases in costs of living. So please stay tuned for our full report about workloads and burnout in long-term care in 2020. I'm looking forward to hearing from Jason Foster and having your questions following his presentation as well.
Sorry for that little delay. Hello all. Nice to see you all. So Alison gave us a really nice bit of research that's looking at a specific group of public sector workers and how austerity and successions of right-wing governments affect their working lives. I'm going to bring it up a notch. I'm going to go up to a higher level of analysis and kind of look at the broader system of public sector labor relations in the province under successive governments. And so this is a very interesting time to try and write a presentation on public sector labor relations in Alberta. I feel like I've had to rewrite the presentation like every second day in the last, and I know, like, for example, there's another bill coming on Monday. That means I would have to rewrite it again. So come back on Tuesday and I'll have a new version for you. And so in the title, what was old is new again, the sort of was originally when I, a couple of months ago, was asked to submit my title before I even knew what I was going to say. It kind of was an expression of my uncertainty about where things were going. As I discuss, in many ways, right away, the UCP was sounding, and in their initial actions, looking like the Tories of old when it came to public sector workers. But something felt different. And I couldn't, but at the time when I submitted the title, I couldn't quite get my hand around it to figure out what is that exactly. So I decided just to put a sort of in there to let me buy me some time. I think now it's starting to become a little clearer. So my main thesis here today is that what we are seeing from the UCP and its calls for rollbacks, the privatization that we're already sort of seeing, and the legal attempts they're making to collar public sector workers' rights, is mostly what Alberta has experienced for the last 25 years. But with a brief respite from the Notley government, which I'll talk about. But this time there's a plot twist, I think. So you're going to have to stick with me to the end, because there's going to be a little bit of a little twist. So let me start with the old. So this isn't working? No. Well, the technology is not working for us today. Okay, you might recognize that fellow. So let me start with a brief history of public sector relations in the past generations or so. And as I want to be brief, my goal here is just to try and capture the essence of the period, and I'm going to be skipping over some details. There are many of you in this room, I suspect, who both experienced this and know the history in great detail. I'm trying to get sort of the broader sort of picture. So what I argue is that for the most part, there's a clear pattern to how the Conservatives handle public sector relations in the province. And it boils down to this. At times of fiscal and economic pressure, and in particular, if the Premier happens to be new and needing to make their mark, the Conservatives push hard against their public sector workers using a range of legal and political tools. And how come it advanced on me? Yeah, there. Okay, sorry. Where was I? Right, so there's a period of aggressive confrontation, as represented by our photo on the left. For those of you of a certain younger age, that is Premier Ralph Klein. At the time, he was the environment minister. That's him giving the finger to an environmental protester. But I felt it was just a nice representation of his attitude towards public sector workers in general. However, these periods of hot wars were then followed up by periods of relative peace, where public sector workers made up some of their lost ground, at least in terms of economically, and could extract some gains from the same government that they were going to war with. Wouldn't call it friendly, but let's just say there was a quiet resentment on both sides of the fence. And that's represented by the photo on the right. Again, our dear friend Ralph Klein, and with him was, at the time, the president of AUPE, Dan McClellan. I think they're at a golf tournament or something, and they're quite cozy and quite chummy at that particular moment. This is not to pick on Brother McClellan. It's more just a representation of, yeah, we go to war, but then afterward, we find a way to keep the relationship together. So let me start with Mr. Klein. There. So, and I start with him, even though there were Conservative premiers before him, but my argument is that he marked a change. He marked a new era in public sector labor relations in this province. And so, famously, in 1993 and 1994, he declared war on public sector workers. There was 20% budget cutbacks across the board. Historians now sort of argue there's about public sector unions lost about 20% of their membership during this period, in the couple of years that followed it. He demanded 5% wage rollbacks, followed by 2 years of wage freezes. He officially called them voluntary. He would like them to voluntarily take 5%, but then he came to the table basically with 5% in the wage envelope gone. And so there was basically no choice. So he ended up getting it through negotiation, but basically it was unions negotiating this under the threat of layoffs. There was aggressive privatization, registries, liquor stores, CKUA, Access TV, went on and on and on. They merged the two separate labor relations boards at the time. For labor relations geeks, that was a fairly significant move. For most people, sort of less so. And in 1995, they briefly debated, but ultimately rejected right-to-work legislation. So pretty ugly couple of years. But by 1996, the revolutionary fervor of Klein and his not-so-merry men had died down. The budget had balanced itself, because they didn't do a whole lot to do it. It mostly balanced itself. The economy was on the upswing, and there was an election coming. And so what happens next for the next 8 years or so is a period of relative calm, at least in the public sector labor relations world. In the early 2000s, no round of bargainings. Most of the unions got some fairly decent wage increases to start making up some of the ground that they lost. As we say, the budget balanced due to high oil prices, which then allowed the Klein government to reinvest in public services, hire more public sector workers, and we start to just sort of generally see some reinvestment. Healthcare privatization was a noted exception under the Klein regime, but in general, during that period, was a period of relative calm. There were some skirmishes, some significant ones, LPNs, the province-wide strike of teachers, so it's not like it was all what did our good friend Don Cherry call milk and honey. It wasn't all positive. But it was a period of relative stability, and the relationships were being repaired. So Klein gets toppled by his own party in 2006 and is unexpectedly replaced by Ed Stelmach. Ed Stelmach is the one exception to this pattern. His 5 years in power are marked by relatively quiet labor relations. He settled a landmark deal with teachers around their pension plan. That had a little bit of controversy, but on the whole was something the teachers wanted. He reinvested in public services to a degree during that period. He did create a bunch of upheaval in the healthcare system through the creation of AHS, but otherwise it was relatively quiet. Why? Because the economy was good. We're booming. He was having no trouble with the budget. He was having no trouble with jobs. And so it was just a relatively quiet period that he could just kind of skate through. He, though, of course, didn't last long either. And was replaced by Alison Redford. She got herself elected both internally for the leadership and in 2012 as something of a moderate. But as soon as she got that election out of the way, she very quickly turned, and it was war again. 2013 was a particularly tumultuous year. They passed Bill 45, which dramatically increased penalties for illegal strikes, like dramatically, so much so that it would have been virtually impossible for any public sector union to choose to go on strike without permission, which of course at that time was always, because public sector workers weren't allowed to strike back then. Bill 46, they passed Bill 46, which imposed a wage settlement based on the current negotiations, basically 2 years of zeros followed by 2 years of 1%. And at around the same time, they made a very public threat that they wanted to restructure the public sector pension plans, basically to increase contributions, decrease payouts. She ended up being less successful in Klein in being able to push much of her agenda. Bill 46 was overturned by the courts, and the subsequent arbitrations offered up some pretty nice wage settlements for public sector workers, but it was through arbitration, not through negotiation. And they backed down on the pensions threat. She, of course, also didn't last long. And then we have the Prentice months. He's a very short tenure premier. So he started off by giving, as often they do, and then he started to take away. So he repealed Bill 45. That's his one positive act in his short period of time. But then he immediately turned around and started talking about wage freezes and rollbacks. His 2015 budget was never passed, but was introduced, responded to the arbitrated wage increases by proposing to create a substantial number of layoffs, basically zeroing it out. So the wage increases, yeah, but we're just going to take all the workers away and we're going to zero sum our actual sort of financial hit. This was a tough talk budget. And had his government survived, had it not been taken down by some bad electoral math, I think we would have seen the beginning of another round of aggressive confrontation with public sector unions and public sector workers. However, that was not to be. Instead, we have the Notley Interregnum, and I mostly only call it the Interregnum because I've always wanted to use the word interregnum. in a presentation, and I finally saw my opportunity. Interregnum, of course, is just sort of a temporary respite or temporary interruption of the regular. So Rachel Notley comes along, and I argue it was a 4-year kind of break in this particular cycle. And I realize that may, amongst some in this room, sound like a controversial statement, but allow me to talk about that. I'm not saying it was all rosy. I'm not saying that it was all friendly and happy and everybody was drinking champagne together. But I would argue in terms of the tone of the public statements from the government and the tone of how negotiations and relations played out, it was a bit of a night and day situation. We have first of all to acknowledge that there were some significant legal changes to the good, the extending the right to strike to public sector workers, a ban on replacement workers when there's essential service agreements in place, pension joint governance, centralized teachers bargaining, so province-wide teacher bargaining, and I think this cannot be understated, consistent, stable funding increases to services, which helped smooth out the system. It meant you weren't trying to get more out of your public sector workers, especially in places like healthcare and education. Of course, they did also negotiate 2 years of wage freezes with every single public sector worker in the province. But I would argue that that bargaining took place in a very different kind of atmosphere. There wasn't a lot of sort of public sort of threat, degrading the public sector workers. It was mostly an issue of, we need the zeros. You give us the zeros, we will give you language. And so the unions made significant gains in their collective agreements around a host of language issues, whether it be layoff protection, whether it be scheduling, whatever their particular issues are. Obviously, each agreement was a little different in terms of how they managed it. But they got something out of taking those zeros. They had to take the zeros. I appreciate that's not a positive thing, but it was a different tone and a different dynamic than what we had seen in the 20 years before. So that was the interregnum. Now we're back to the new again. So today, with the barrage of announcements and changing patterns, can we say that we're just back to the old Tory pattern? Maybe. In the early going, I would argue, seems like it, right? There was Bill 9 almost immediately, which delayed arbitrations that were coming in wage reopeners that had been negotiated by the NDP. And then more recently, the changing the position at the arbitration tables, saying, no, instead of a zero, we want a 2% on average wage rollback. Of course, the Blue Ribbon Panel hinted at legislated pay bans for public sector workers. Bill 21 creates secret mandates for public bodies, which is a really significant and unusual step in terms of mandating how universities, school boards, and so forth manage their public sector relations, how they manage their negotiations. Of course, it eliminates the anti-scab that the NDP had set up, and it also capped severance and notice periods for public sector workers, a little piece that many people may not have noticed. Their language is not only a tone of austerity, but they're actively pointing to public sector workers as being the problem, as being overpaid. They're being paid more than public sector workers in other jurisdictions, not providing the context of everybody's income in Alberta is higher than other jurisdictions, and so public sector workers are just kind of at par. But that's not what they're doing. They're making public sector workers to be the main part of the problem and why they're in this financial crisis. And so Budget 2019, with its sweeping cutbacks in many areas of public service, is also an indicator of that particular pattern. And again, we're also now starting to see some early stages of renewed privatization, which is, of course, privatization is always an attack on public sector and public sector workers in particular. So the rhetoric and the early actions of the UCP government are remarkably similar, not just to Klein, because we've been hearing a lot of those particular comparisons, but to the series of conservative governments over the past 25 years. Redford and Prentice engaged in similar types of rhetoric and aggressive action against their workers. Stelmach, I argue, just got lucky because of the economy. And so, yeah, I argue the pattern seems to be reasserting itself. And we're back in that phase of the government using a crisis, whether it be real or imagined, to point the finger at public sector workers and seeing just how far it can push its agenda against them. So where do we go from here? This is where the sort of comes in. Many things look the same: the manufactured crisis, the blaming of public sector workers, the heavy-handed approach to bargaining. But the context is different. This is the plot twist. This is the piece that I couldn't quite get my head around a couple of months ago. Some of the things about this new context are good for public sector workers and some are bad. But it's different, and I think it's going to mean that there's a potential for different outcomes as a result, which I'll come back to. So first of all, on the worst side, the UCP are not the old PCs. The moderating effect that the Alberta Conservative Party had, in terms of it always had its faction of moderates and its faction of folk who tried to keep the party as a relatively big tent, that's gone. This is a party of true believers. This is a party that has an ideological component that many of the premiers that came before and governments that came before did not have. Ralph Klein may now today be seen as an enemy of the working class, but he wasn't a particularly ideological guy. He did it because that was the politics of the time and he could get away with it. This group is different. And I don't know exactly what that means in terms of the decision making, but it might just mean that they might be prepared to just absorb more pushback than previous governments did, and they might also deign to push farther than other governments dared to do. Second, the right across the globe is ascendant, as you all know, fueled by working class anger and economic uncertainty. So there may be amongst the population more appetite and more acceptance of this kind of aggressive agenda than there may have been in the past. And third, an oil boom ain't going to save us this time, kids. There is going to be no oil boom, no $100 barrel oil to come in, magically make the books work, magically make the budget balance, and then we can get back to a period of relative peace. So that's on the negative side. Sounds pretty dire, I know. But there are some things in our favor, I argue. First, the legal context in which the government is operating is different. The Supreme Court in recent years has entrenched worker rights in ways that make it harder for governments to do what they used to be able to do. They could still do it potentially, but it's just they got to find new ways and more creative ways to do it, and there are just certain things they can't do that they thought they could in the past. However, and so it's just harder for the state to be able to exert its will on public sector workers. However, the legal route is slow, and we can question how effective it can really be. By the time we start getting the current court decisions that might favor public sector workers, a lot of the damage will already have been done. But it's important to know that there are legal routes that weren't there before. Second, I argue the face of Alberta is changing. The two major cities now are cosmopolitan urban centers with diverse peoples and diversifying economies. They are not the sort of one industry towns that they were 25 years ago. And I argue that amongst portions of those folks, those kind of harsh conservative austerity politics don't play over as well, and that there may actually be an electoral consequence that there wouldn't been 25 years ago. And of course, we can't forget that immigration also continues to transform who we are as a province. And these demographic changes, they're not changing. They're just going to keep going over time. We're becoming more urban, we're becoming more international, and that will shape Alberta politics. And finally, if the election of the NDP did anything, it smashed the illusion of Alberta as a one-party state. We've proven that we will change government sometimes. And so how that affects citizens' engagement with politics, I think remains to be seen. But I think, in the context of fighting an anti-worker government is different today than it was in the 1990s. I was there. In the 1990s, it just felt like the Tories were inevitable. Right? And so you were fighting a losing battle. I don't know what happens when you have a population who now knows and has experienced the world of changing parties at election time. That may have an impact on what happens. And so one last thing before I close is I want to highlight that I have left out one very important piece in my analysis, and I did so intentionally. And that is the response of labor in all of this. So what about labor? They are the big question mark. And I argue. They're the big question mark in how we understand how this will play out over the next 4 years. Much like the conservative patterns that I've just outlined for you, there have been patterns to labor's response to these attacks as well. And I would describe the pattern this way. Lots of heated rhetoric by the union's leadership. Lots and lots of heated rhetoric. Large promises of big fight backs that never fully materialize. Much mobilization that took place. There was lots of rallies, lots of protests, lots of things happening. There's no question about that. And in each era, there were key events that kind of marked a moment where you had to see something shift, whether it would be in '94, the laundry workers' strike, the AUPE illegal strike of 2000, the ATA province-wide strike in 2002, or the 2013 wildcat strike of jail guards. So there were moments that punctuated the fight back and punctuated the response. But what remained elusive was an overall coordinated approach that brought first of all of the labor movement together. During all of these periods of aggressive attacks, the private sector was largely on the sidelines. Private sector unions mostly didn't engage. There were exceptions, but mostly they stayed on the sidelines. And secondly, and probably even more importantly, there was never no success or very little success at reaching out beyond labor movement circles to other aspects of civil society, other aspects of community, other communities affected by cutbacks. That's always been one of the tough struggles in Alberta in trying to fight back on the attacks that happen. And so I think to that end, it's debatable how effective labor's response has been over the years to the challenges. And I think it has to be noted that there has always been a willingness on part of labor that once it dies back down into that period of quiet détente to reestablish normal relations. That there is no, in the end, long-term pushback against the state and the state's imposition of its will against public sector workers. And so I think that's the big question for today, is how will the labor movement respond this time? And so far, the reaction's fitting the pattern, but we're in early days. We're seeing lots of rhetoric, starting to see some ramping up of mobilization, but not yet any sort of broader coordinated patterns. But it's early days, so I don't want to make any sort of firm conclusion. I have no predictions whatsoever of how things will transpire. All I could point out is that what happened in the past and observe what is happening today and then leave that for the rest of you. So is everything old new again? Or in 2019, 2020, do we break the pattern? And I just don't know. That is up to Albertans to decide. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alison and Jason. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, but I'm Jerry Taves, and I work for one of those labor unions. So there's a bit of a throwdown. But we have a couple of wonderful mic runner volunteers. Why don't you introduce yourselves first? Because we always say mic runner volunteers, but we don't ask your names. Who's helping us out today?
Suzanne.
Suzanne and?
Mancharn.
Mancharn?
Mancharn, yeah, you said it right.
Great. All right, we're going to go in threes, and we'll do some mixing it up. The woman in green, I think, with the hat, and then my friend Tom Fuller, because he asks hard questions, and then this woman in the front here.
I have a question for Alison about your research on long-term care. So I'm a union organizer who works with a lot of long-term care workers. And in our organizing work, we have identified that a significant pressure point for employers, particularly when we're seeking a first contract, is the residents and families, and often these resident family councils. However, we face really significant challenges when we're trying to build solidarity between residents and their families and workers. And a significant barrier we found is racism. So the vast majority of workers are women of color and or immigrants, and the majority of residents are white. And we've also found that there is a significant amount of shame that is associated with having family members in a long-term care facility that makes families unwilling to make public statements or to pressure employers or to assist unions in contract fights. So I was wondering if you have found in your research any promising ways to build solidarity between residents, their families, and the workers in long-term care facilities, or if you have any ideas about fruitful paths for unions to explore to better build that solidarity.
Thanks. Tom.
Yeah, Jason, I just want to, some of your last remarks regarding the difficulties unions experience and their pushback with coordinating their efforts and also in involving the larger public. And I just wanted to remind you that in the immediate run-up to Ralph Klein's premiership, and the first part of his premiership, there was something called the Common Front in Alberta. The Common Front was basically an alliance initially between the Alberta Teachers Association, the Alberta Federation of Labour, AUPE, I believe, most of the unions. And it was also intended to mobilize public support and involve the public. I think it turned out to be a little bit of a Potemkin village. That is, they never succeeded in getting the public involved for a couple of reasons, one of which is the climate of public opinion at the time, which was sort of hysterical, I think, but also because they couldn't find ways to access the public through civil society groups. In other words, there was no way to approach the public except as sort of individuals through ads or whatever. But it seems to me it's an issue that some budding historian might want to take a look at, is go back and look at that Common Front and see the extent to which it was successful, the extent to which it failed, and why it failed.
I love seeing the nods. It's almost like a collective nightmare coming back for some of you. And over here.
Thank you, Alison and Jason. My name's Anna Johnson. I'm a registered nurse here in Edmonton. Alison, I'm wondering if you can speak about the audit system in place by HS for private facilities that receive public funding for the continuing care facilities. There's one in Vegreville Century Park that recently fired 52 AUPE workers only to offer their jobs back at lower wages and benefits. And this is a facility that fails audit after audit after audit. I'm wondering how this is allowed to continue to happen.
Thanks. So, Alison, I wonder if you want to deal with those two questions about long-term care first, and then we'll go back to Jason.
Sure. So thank you, Kate, for that softball. Wow. Can't wait to talk about shame and solidarity. First, on the note of shame, I think, firstly, people should not have to feel ashamed of no longer being capable of taking care of their family member in their own home. Again, facing advanced acuity and advanced age when it comes to care needs, and also because being in a long-term care should not be shameful. That should not be something in an ideal society where we shouldn't have this public imaginary of these being bad places where scary things happen. Unfortunately, that has been allowed to happen as quality of care is eroded, again, over huge periods of neoliberalism, under management that is largely uncaring and indifferent to the conditions faced by workers and by residents. So we need to challenge that narrative, I think, around these being bad places, especially these should be seen as places that could be good and could be better and could be safe and caring and sources of community and socialization and care for the people that live there and for the people that work in those sites. So I think that's one nexus around which we can build solidarity. Of course, like I mentioned earlier, this is fairly early stages. I think also when we have a better sense of what specific policies are contributing the most to staff having a hard time, we can communicate that to resident families as well. And hopefully they can rally around that and around quality of care. Another thing to note too is that I think in this province in general, there's a unwillingness on the part of many people to identify themselves with the working class and to identify themselves with the, again, largely feminized, racialized, many immigrant workers that work in these facilities, to see them as a fellow worker. That's obviously a project that is huge and needs to be ongoing in this province, but these are all ways I think that we could destigmatize long-term care and build those powerful, supportive relationships of solidarity between residents and families so that we can advocate for better care and better conditions for work. In terms of audits and firing, I don't know a ton about the audit system. For me, this is a fairly new topic and one in which we're still exploring the different relationships that we want to tease out in the research and in the advocacy we can build from that over time. Certainly, it was so disheartening to see the firings in the news and hearing that they're being offered low pay and worse benefits. As much as So I mean, I'm focusing a lot on the people that are doing like the lowest paid work in long-term care, but almost no one who works in long-term care is making a wonderful wage unless you're the owner of one of these facilities, right? The nurses and the management are also not being compensated in ways that many of us would consider to be a very good quality of life. And so to see this essential work, again, work of care, like literally vital work, not being recognized as valuable is, I think, really shameful on the parts of owners. And that also needs to be backed up by our government, to be perfectly honest, and by AHS, who need to recognize that, like, everyone who is in these facilities needs to have a high quality of life, regardless of whether they are sleeping in the beds overnight or whether they are manning a nursing station overnight. So.
Yes, the Common Front. Thank you for bringing them up. I think I attended some of the Common Front meetings, not as someone in the labor movement, but as someone who's involved in some of those other civil society groups that we're trying to bring in to that coalition. And so I can say from that perspective, the Common Front was not successful for a variety of reasons, one of which is it wasn't particularly welcoming to civil society groups. And so I think my point is that it's not that the public sector unions and workers and the labor movement in general haven't tried to figure out how to create better coordination. It's not that they haven't wanted to figure out how to reach out to other groups, such as, like, AISH recipients whose pensions are being de-indexed, for example. It's just that it's not easy. It's hard. And the labor movement and the structure of labor unions does in many ways work against the kind of relationship building that needs to happen. And so so my comments are meant to kind of look at what is a structural issue in labor relations and in the labor movement. And I think the Common Front's a good example of well-intentioned, right idea, poor execution.
Great, and if it was anything back then like it is today, there's just so much going on that it's hard to keep all the balls in the air and keep all the groups, to connect with all the groups that we would like to. More questions. We've got a woman in the back, and this person here, and one more. I thought I saw someone over here. Oh, right down, Ms. Smith down front.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that Heather's here. My comments are addressed to you, Alison. I've got 35 years of nursing experience. I am retired now, but I've seen and done a lot in the healthcare field. My comments are that workload algorithms, criteria that determine workload, can be a problem. And that is because the private network is downloading more and more complexity into the public domain. And how they determine their workload is fraught with problems when you can't cover the complexity of the patients. The language is too broad, too neutral. That's one comment. The other is chemical restraint. And that is when you're working with short-staffed, there is propensity of the elderly being chemically sedated for the whole day. They just sit in their chair and nobody bothers with them because they're too busy. Very rarely, unless you've got enough volunteers, do they get fed properly, unless the family is there to feed them. So my comment to you, Alison, is if you're going to look at a couple of these things in the continuing care system.
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments for Alison. I'm substituting for my wife, who is unfortunately ill, but she could give you chapter and verse. First, there are three classes of operator: the government, the not-for-profit sector, and the private sector. they all have different reasons and different interests, but they all have the same interest in minimizing cost. And so you get a race to the bottom, which doesn't help the quality of care. In terms of how this is affecting things, I don't know if the workers' comp data are accessible, but there should be an inverse correlation between the staffing levels and the number of workplace injuries. And third, this whole scene is a mass of contradictions. For instance, if I, as a private individual, try looking after somebody at home and things go wrong, I can be charged under the criminal code for failing to provide the necessaries of life. The same thing can happen in congregate living and nothing is done. So this past week, we were at the Alberta Association on Gerontology Symposium, and my plea for what I'd like to see in 2030, if not sooner, is the same protections given to seniors in care as is provided to children and animals.
Heather, go ahead with your question as well. We'll take three at the same time.
Actually, I have a couple of comments. One is following up on John's comment around long-term care, and that is a heads up. The standards in long-term care, and I'm talking about nursing home, the highest level of acuity, are regulated by the Nursing Home Act. And the only legislation we have in this province with respect to staffing, minimal staffing in any, including acute care, is in the regulations to the Nursing Home Act. And we have to be very, very vigilant because there is a lot of concern that this government, is it still on? A lot of concern that this government will in fact move to change the I can talk there. Yeah. We'll move to change the regulations, which is only requires an order in council. It doesn't have to be debated before the legislature, and that is very, very serious. I would encourage anybody interested in long-term care to check out the Public Interest Alberta website, which has incredible information and recommendations around long-term care. A lot of it based on the recommendations from John's wife, Carol Wodak. So that's one thing. I also have a comment with respect to the actions of Labour under Conservative governments. And I would suggest to you that yes, there was something called the Common Front. It was an early initiative during the Klein years, and it was the Common Front itself was mostly and only really Labour. That morphed into a much bigger coalition of Labour and seniors groups and all kinds of other groups. And the broader coalition is what basically defeated the third way, Ralph Klein's third way. Some of you were probably not even born, but some of you may remember being at huge rallies at the Ledge, being at the huge rally with Shirley Douglas and Kiefer Sutherland and that kind of stuff. That was all part of a very broad coalition that was a combination of Labour and broader social groups. The last comment, let me just see what I had here. No, maybe I'll just stop there. I'm just suggesting that, to suggest that the Labour movement didn't reach out and didn't in fact engage a broader social group in this province is wrong. And I would also point out that it was during those years that Labour, both organized with the AFL and not with the AFL, because we weren't with the AFL at the time, is the reason that this entity exists. We formed Parkland. We formed Public Interest Alberta as part of a organized pushback against the Klein agenda.
All the speakers aren't working.
Oh, the speakers aren't. Well, then I'm not going to repeat what, I'm just going to make sure that everyone heard what Heather had to say. But, also, who's up for a Tom Fuller versus Heather Smith debate? No. T folks.
So thank you. I'll try and holler so everyone here. So the first question around workload algorithms, private downloading, and chemical restraint, those are all certainly pervasive, definitely happening. I think we're, from this study, going to hear the most about workload algorithms and private downloading again when it comes to the kinds of care that private facilities will provide compared to public facilities, and then of course the speaking to the second question in terms of all three kinds of facility being pressured to minimize costs and the attendant effects that has on workers and on the quality of care. I think those are all going to come out, especially when we're looking, so to speak to the second question as well, around workers' compensation, worker injury. Yes, I think all of the union people who are in the room know that when their workers are facing higher and higher pressure, less and less staffing, they do get injured more often. And so one of the questions in our study is around the kinds of injuries that people experience at work. So those include things like slips, trips, falls, burns, cuts, scrapes, needle pricks, violence from residents, from management, from family members, from other staff. And what we're seeing in like the very early days of getting data back is those are all things that are happening, unfortunately. One way in which this gets expressed as we have less people on shift and as there's no coverage for things like sick days, vacations, for stress leave. So if there isn't adequate staff, people who need two carers to help them, for example, move, there's only one staff member to help someone get into a chair from their bed, for example, and that opens up a lot of opportunities for back injuries and for falls for both the resident and for the carer. So we are seeing that come through, unfortunately. And yeah, the people that are in care need protection, as do the workers. I think legislating minimum care so that there's like an enforceable standard for operators is one way to approach that, in terms of if you are not providing a certain level of care, you are like you're breaking the law. That is one way to approach it, and I'm not sure, like we haven't really worked out whether that's the best way, but it's certainly one area to explore. And yeah, as was mentioned, I think in the third comment, Public Interest Alberta's Seniors Committee does amazing work, sometimes about long-term care and about other issues in general that impact seniors' quality of life, and it's all really good, interesting work to draw on when looking at these kinds of topics, and to provide additional context about the lived realities of seniors' care and long-term care in this province.
Jason, can you add for 1 minute?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I think you remind us of some important things, not the least of the creation of the Parkland Institute. I think that is an important thing. My point is to not say that the labor movement didn't do anything. My point is not to say that the labor movement didn't succeed at times in mobilizing and in defeating conservative attacks. I'm just making the argument that as we face another wave of attacks from conservative governments, it is a good moment to look back at our history and ask ourselves what worked, what didn't work. If it didn't work, why didn't it work, and how can we do it better this time? That, I think, is what I was hoping for a takeaway for this week. To have us all collectively go away to say, how can we do this differently so that we have different outcomes?
All right, thanks everybody for your participation.